All right, good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to take this moment to welcome you to our webinar today, Grant Writing Strategies for Success, being presented by Lauren Clark and Beth Herron of the Office of Research at the University of South Carolina. I'm Heather Brandt, Associate Dean for Professional Development in the Graduate School at the University of South Carolina, and this webinar is part of our Grad Prof DEV Professional Development for Graduate Students programming. And this is our final webinar of the semester. If you missed our earlier webinar on the Affordable Care Act, the recording of that webinar will be available later today. We hope that you will stay in touch with us and use the calendar of events on the gradschool.sc.edu website to keep up with opportunities for you to focus on professional development. At this time, I'm going to turn things over to Lauren and Beth to get started with the presentation. So Lauren and Beth, in just a moment here, if you have any questions during the presentation, please use the chat box. We also have handouts available for this webinar under the Handouts tab, which is part of the pop-up menu on the side of your screen. So Lauren and Beth, take it away.
Good afternoon and welcome to our first webinar version of the Grant Basics Workshop. My name is Lauren Clark and I'm the Research Program Manager in the Office of the Vice President for Research.
And I'm Beth Herron, and I'm the Associate Director of the Research and Grant Development Office, which also is part of the Office for the Vice President of Research.
Sorry, I'm trying to go back, and I don't see the back button.
There you go.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We always get questions from graduate students and sometimes postdocs about why grant writing is so important and why should graduate students and postdocs consider writing their own grants at this stage of their career. If you learn to write a competitive proposal at this stage in your career, it will set you up for future success later. It helps you build a track record of funding on your own, and once you have funding, then it often becomes easier to acquire more funding. It's also a way to expand your network of collaborators. When you write a grant proposal, often you're working with a group of people and sometimes new researchers as well. So that's a way to expand your network of collaborators. It often allows you to work on a team with more experienced researchers, and there's a lot of learning that can be acquired from more senior faculty or researchers as you work on a proposal together. And regardless of what discipline you're in, grant writing is probably going to be an important skill to develop for your future career, whether it's in academics or if it's a career that's not in academics.
Okay, the first question most people have is, where do I find grants? Where are they? And one of the best resources that I can recommend to you is called COS Pivot, and you can see the hyperlink to that website there. The Office of Research pays for a subscription to this website on behalf of the university. So anyone with a University of South Carolina email address can register an account and use this website anywhere in the world. If you're not registered, you can only use it here on campus. And Pivot is a database, a constantly updated database of almost 30,000 funding opportunities. And it's hard to believe that there are that many funding opportunities out there, but there are. And the nice thing about Pivot is it's for all disciplines. They actually used to call themselves Community of Science, but they decided that gave people the wrong impression that it was only for STEM disciplines, when in reality they search and find opportunities for all disciplines. It has small grants, large grants. It has a lot of opportunities for students and postdocs, a lot of dissertation funding opportunities, travel opportunities. So I would strongly encourage you after the webinar to go to that website, register an account, and start playing around with it. Once you are registered and do searches, you can save searches, and then Pivot will send you an email once a week with funding opportunities related to that search. So it actually starts doing the work for you, which is nice. And it doesn't bombard you with emails. It just sends you one email a week on Sunday evenings. So Pivot is a super place for you to get started when you're looking for external funding opportunities.
If you're a graduate student at the University of South Carolina, we also have an internal funding competition called the Spark Graduate Research Grant. And this is a great place to get started. It's a small grant. It's for $5,000, but it teaches you the process of preparing a proposal, submitting a proposal, and going through the review process. Whether or not you're funded, you'll receive feedback from 2 faculty reviewers here at USC. It's available to all disciplines, but the Spark program is limited to doctoral students, MFA students, and MA in Public History students. We have about a 35% funding rate, which is a very competitive yet hopeful funding rate. Really good proposals that have a great question and are well developed and follow all the directions are going to be competitive. A number of students who receive Spark grants have used that opportunity, that experience, to turn around and then write larger national fellowships, which have been funded in many cases. So whether or not you're funded, it's a great opportunity to learn the process. You will come away with a better understanding of grant writing, and you will have hopefully learned things that will help make your next proposal stronger.
And if there are any postdocs listening, we also have an opportunity for you. It's part of our larger Aspire program, and it's the Aspire 1 Track 2B opportunity. It's open to postdocs from all disciplines. There are grants of up to $5,000. And we also have a very competitive yet hopeful funding rate, I like that term, of 35 to 40%. And this can provide a springboard for larger grant opportunities. It provides postdocs an opportunity to start with their own independent research agenda. And that's really important, is that it's a research project that, while related to the work you're doing currently, is not the same work that your mentor or supervisor is doing. The deadline for Aspire is coming up in January, and we're actually having a special question and answer session just for postdocs, just for Aspire 1 Track 2B, on December 15th at 2 p.m. in Sumwalt 102. And Sumwalt is in the main part of campus. It's adjacent to the Coker Life Sciences building. The easiest way to get into it is off of Green Street. So I would encourage you to come and attend that session if you're interested in applying for Aspire this year if you're a postdoc.
So we'd like to discuss now the basic components of a grant proposal. Every grant program is different, so you have to carefully read the guidelines for each program, but these are the parts of a proposal that you might come across. Some federal grants have a letter of transmittal, which is basically a formal letter stating that you are applying to this particular program and this is the title of your grant. Many grants require a title page. Spark does not. I'm not sure about Aspire.
We do require a title page. Yeah.
Sometimes a table of contents is required. Abstracts are often required, but the Spark grant is an exception to that. There's a project description, which is really the heart of your proposal. That when you think about writing a proposal, the project description is what you're normally thinking about. The limits can be fairly short in terms of numbers of pages, so you have to pack a lot of information into a small amount of space often. There's always a budget and a budget justification where you explain what you need in terms of funds and exactly how you're going to use those funds. There's usually a bio sketch or a vitae. There's usually a specific format that's requested for each grant. And appendices are sometimes allowed depending on the proposal, and it's something you want to make sure and check the guidelines to see if they're allowed or not.
How do proposals get funded? Well, really they're funded on the quality of 3 basic things. First, the idea. Is the idea innovative? Is it exciting? Is it something new? Obviously, reviewers are looking for innovation. They're looking for something different. They're looking for something to fill a gap in the science, no matter what your field is. They're funded based on the quality of the proposed plan. Can you do the work that you've outlined in the proposal in the time that you've outlined? Do you have clear objectives? Do you have a clear hypothesis? And finally, and it's last but definitely not least, is how have you presented all this? Grants have to be well presented, and proposals that have a lot of typos, grammatical errors, don't follow the guidelines, tend to drop to the bottom of lists in proposal review. So you really need to think about all three of those elements as you're starting to work on your grant proposal.
This was a comment made by a faculty member in a review committee meeting, and Beth and I both really liked it, and so we included it in this seminar. And you have to remember, in terms of thinking about who gets funded and who doesn't, that reviewers have to review the grant they are given, not the one they wish that you had written. So you might have a fantastic idea, but if you turn in a really sloppy proposal that's full of errors, you're probably not going to be competitive. As much as the reviewers might want to recommend your proposal for funding because it's a great idea, if you have a lot of errors in the proposal and haven't followed the guidelines correctly, you're probably not going to be recommended for funding.
Okay. When Lauren and I were invited to do a presentation to graduate students a while back, we sort of came upon this framework for this presentation, which is 10 common mistakes in grant writing and how to avoid them. And I tell you that these are all mistakes that you want to avoid as you're working on your proposal, whether it be an internal proposal or an external one.
I'll also add that we drew from our experiences from managing grant programs here at the university. And no matter what the level of proposal, whether it was a large multi-million-dollar interdisciplinary proposal put together by USC faculty members or $5,000 Spark proposals written by graduate students, we discussed the same mistakes that people make sort of across all spectrums. And that was why we wanted to sort of let you in on the common mistakes that we see in grant writing so that you can hopefully learn to avoid these early and be more successful faster in your career. So one of the first mistakes that people make when writing grants is that they assume that all of the reviewers for their grant are going to be from their specific field, that they're going to know the context, and that they're going to understand why your work is significant. If you make this assumption that your reviewers are always going to be from your field, then reviewers who are not from your field will feel very frustrated while they're reading your proposal. And you might get comments to the effect of these. The investigator assumes that the reviewer is an expert in their field. This proposal uses a lot of jargon and is hard to follow for a researcher outside of the field. These are comments that you don't want because the reviewer doesn't feel like the proposal has been explained in a way that is clear to them and the significance is clear. So one of the first things you need to do before you start writing your proposal is find out who your audience is. Is this going to a very broad group of scientists? Is it going to go to people generally from your field? You have to know who the reviewers might be generally so that you can write the proposal appropriately for that audience. Oftentimes, review agencies and foundations are going to pull reviewers from a variety of disciplines. So you have got to write the proposal so that people from outside your specific lab and your specific area of research will be able to follow the logic and understand the context. One way to try to improve your proposal from this standpoint is to ask friends from other departments to read your proposal and ask them if it makes sense or what they didn't understand, and then try to write your proposal in a way that people from different disciplines can understand what you're trying to get across and why it's significant.
And I'd like to add that for our internal programs, for both Aspire and Spark, there will not be someone from your department reading your proposal. We avoid that because of conflicts of interest. So if you're in the history department, there will not be someone from the Department of History reading your proposal. So it's very important to know that you're writing for an educated audience and for people who are in fields close to yours, but it will not be someone with a specific knowledge of your part of the field you're working in. Mistake number 2, don't bother to read the guidelines or follow directions exactly as described in the guidelines. And unfortunately, this is a mistake that is made over and over and over again. I've worked on probably hundreds of grant submissions and grant applications since I've worked at USC for almost 20 years. And the first thing I do when I'm approached by someone to assist with a grant is to print out the guidelines, and I read through them probably 3 or 4 times. I underline things, I star things, I highlight things that are important. Because if you don't do this, you're going to end up with comments such as, this proposal is not formatted correctly. Almost every grant guidelines request that you use a certain font or font size, that your margins be a certain width, that you have a certain number of pages. So you need to really follow that. That's an important part. It seems like a trivial thing, but it's an important part of grantsmanship. You might not have a complete proposal because if you haven't read the guidelines, you'll have missed a required supporting document, or you're supposed to download a certain form and sign it. The proposal did not mention how this research would be disseminated. The guidelines ask for this information. Sometimes grant guidelines do go through and tell you exactly what you're supposed to talk about in your research plan, and if you overlook one of those areas, your proposal might end up not even being reviewed. And this has become a big issue with some federal agencies. National Science Foundation in particular has decided that one way it's going to reduce the number of proposals read by reviewers is to reject proposals for very sort of small violations of their guidelines. So, for example, they're looking very carefully at fonts. They will return proposals that have references that are not formatted correctly. If your biosketch is not formatted the way they want it, they'll return it. If you're not using their headings or their current and pending support forms. We just had a proposal from NSF returned because it was part of not following what was supposed to be in the research plan, and they missed an element that was required to be in the research plan, and it was returned without review. And NIH, to date, has not been quite as stringent as NSF, but they're moving in that direction, and they do look closely at biosketches and at elements that are required. NIH has quite a few forms and such that are required in their applications, and so that's something that they're looking at very closely. So, as I mentioned before, strategies for success. Read the guidelines not just once or twice, but numerous times. Keep going back to them and checking to make sure you have everything that they're asking for. Follow the directions exactly as outlined, and realize that funding agencies, and that includes our internal programs, can and will reject proposals for noncompliance with the guidelines. And I know that as the administrator for SPARC, I'm taking on your job, Lauren, for Aspire, I do go through, and there are things that I've returned proposals for because they do not comply with our guidelines. And I think the same is true of the SPARC program.
So a third mistake that's common is to write the proposal using solid blocks of text with no breaks, no headings, no subheadings, and trying to use the smallest font possible. I think this mistake comes about because people struggle to fit the amount of information they think needs to go into the proposal into the allowed number of pages. So to sort of try to have it both ways, they don't leave spaces between paragraphs, they don't include headings, and this can backfire. Even if the information in there is very good, even if you follow all the guidelines, You can still get comments like this. This proposal is very dense and hard to read. This proposal is not well organized. The text is so small in the figure captions that I cannot read it. I have no idea what the figures mean. As someone reading proposals, it is really challenging to sit down to just solid blocks of text with no breaks and no white space. And that kind of puts reviewers off right off the bat because it's just very hard to read and it's hard to sort of keep the flow of information going in their minds. So to avoid this problem, the strategy for success that we suggest is to break up the text with headings and subheadings to make it easier to understand and easy for the reviewer to follow. Think about it as you want to sort of walk the reviewer through your proposal in the easiest way possible for them to be able to connect the dots. You want to write with clarity. You want to be really clear, really succinct. Try to shorten sentences to just state what you need to state and nothing else. So when you can leave white space and you can organize the proposal and you can include subheadings and headings to guide the reviewer through the proposal, you will have a higher likelihood of the reviewer being pleased with the formatting of the proposal and probably able to follow it and understand it a little better. I'm trying to advance. Oh, okay.
So mistake number 4, do not have a clearly defined hypothesis or research question. The reviewers will be able to figure that out on their own. And I think that gets back to writing the grant for the reviewer and not making the reviewer guess at things or wish that you had put something else on the paper. The comments that you'll see when this mistake is made is that there is no hypothesis in this proposal. I don't understand what question is being asked. Data will be gathered, but I'm not sure what questions will be answered. There are no clear objectives or aims, and there is no hypothesis. You need to be very clear to the reviewer exactly what it is you are aiming to do, and that should be a focal point of your proposal. So strategies for success with this are to clearly define the hypothesis you are testing or the research question you are asking. And I worked with a young faculty person here quite a few years ago who I think did something very effective in that he would actually show the reviewers his hypothesis by using italics or bold or an underline. You don't want too much of that in a proposal. You don't want to go crazy with different fonts. But it really drew the reviewer immediately to what it was he was trying to do. And he would write things like, this will fill the gap in my field because this question will accomplish this. He didn't make the reviewers do the work to try to guess what it was he was trying to do. So I just keep that as a starting point in your proposal. Don't bury your hypothesis or your research questions so deep into the text that they can't discern, what it is you're trying to accomplish.
Another common mistake deals with your timeline and whether or not the project is feasible. A mistake that people make when writing proposals sometimes is from being way too vague about how much time they think it will take to complete the project. Another mistake along these same lines is to sort of promise the moon and shoot for the stars with the amount of work included in the proposal, with the assumption that the reviewers will think, okay, if I propose it, then I should be able to do it. If you either aren't very specific and realistic about your timeline, and if you promise to do too much and not enough time, you'll get comments of this nature. The project is extremely ambitious and cannot be finished in the time frame. The investigator does not understand how long the lab work will take. How can you present at a conference in November when the research is still being conducted in October? So to be successful in this part of your proposal, I think the key is to frame your proposal as being feasible. Can you do this proposal in this amount of time with this amount of money? You've got to be able to address that in your proposal and make it clear to the reviewers that, yes, this is feasible. One way to do that is to create a timeline. Often a graphical timeline is helpful, some kind of bar graph or chart or something where you mark off the months or the time period and when certain tasks will be accomplished within the grant proposal. This is one way to illustrate that you have a clear understanding of how much time it takes to do the work. If you propose to create a brand new method from scratch that's incredibly complex and has never been done before, and you say you're going to get that done in a month, a lot of reviewers might have a question about that. You want to directly address the issue of project feasibility and make it clear to the reviewers that you understand how much work is involved, how long it's going to take, and that you can do it within the given time frame.
Mistake number 6. You can assume the reviewers will know the relevant background information and sources for your work, so you don't need to worry about a thorough review of the literature for context. Now this gets back to the issue of who is your audience, who are the reviewers, and that they probably will not be faculty people from your exact field, so they might not know what is important to your field. That's the very first comment. There is no context for this proposal. Why is this question important? Why should I or anyone else care? Has no one in the world ever looked at this problem before? If so, great. You should explain that. If that's not the case, why are there no references? And you do have to be very mindful of the fact that someone might read your proposal and go out and do a search in Google Scholar and find some much more current work than you've cited. You need to show that you're on top of your field and that you understand what's going on and that you don't want to use all older references. You don't want to overlook a reference that might be very important and related to your work. At the same time, you don't want a lit review to become the whole focus of your proposal. So there is a balancing act there. Most proposals, you have very limited space. For our internal grants, it's 3 pages. Even external grants might only be 5 or 6 pages or 10 pages at most. So you certainly don't want to spend half your proposal on this very extensive lit review, but you need to illustrate that you know what's happening in your discipline. So provide a thorough review of the literature as you can, and use references appropriately. And again, keep in mind that you need to set the stage for reviewers as to why this is such an important question and why what you are doing can really advance your field or fill a gap in your field, because they probably won't know that on their own.
So another common mistake that is entirely avoidable is to have grammatical errors, spelling errors, different fonts. It's very obvious when prior proposals have been cut and pasted together, when different fonts are mixed into one proposal and the fonts aren't all changed to the same font. These are details that may seem small and trivial, but these can add up to a major, major mistake and a very small likelihood of funding. When you make grammatical errors, when you misspell words, reviewers get very frustrated, and you will receive comments of this nature. This proposal contains numerous grammatical errors, which dampens my enthusiasm significantly. This proposal needs to have someone proofread for proper use of the English language. Proofreading is extremely important. Language errors are very distracting. This proposal contains different fonts and appears to have been cut and pasted together. You need to think about your proposal as an example of your very best work that you're presenting to the reviewers. Your proposal is basically saying to them, this is what I'm capable of. So you certainly don't want to hand them something that's full of errors. That doesn't instill confidence in them giving you large amounts of money to then do the work. if you submit a proposal that's full of simple things like grammatical errors and spelling errors. So it is imperative that you proofread your proposal numerous times. You want to ask other people to proofread your proposal as well. Sometimes when you look at something for a long time, you can't see the mistakes any longer. You really need to have friends and colleagues who can proofread as well. You want to make sure that that proposal makes a good impression, that the work you produce is top-notch, it's fantastic, it's solid, and if you're funded, you're probably going to go off to do great things with that money.
Okay. Mistake number 8. The supporting materials are not as important as the project description, so you can just pull those together at the last minute. Ask for not-allowed items on your budget. They'll probably bend the rules when they see how much you need something. Almost every grant is not just the research plan. It's the research plan plus a whole host of supporting materials that together creates the entire grant package. So it's really important that you are looking at the whole package and not just the research plan, because overlooking one of the other elements could sink your chances of success. Some of the things we see in our internal programs is, the budget is missing a justification. Almost every grant, in addition to showing your expenses, because when you're asking for a grant, you're asking for money, so you have to present your expenses, and you also have to present a justification for those expenses. There are often forms about what other kinds of funding you're applying for, which is called current and pending support. And not all, but many agencies in our internal programs require those. Omitting the current and pending support form on an NSF grant, for example, it'll just get sent back and not be reviewed. Letters of support are very important to show that if you're planning to go to a lab or an archive or to work with someone, those letters are evidence of that. And sometimes they're required, sometimes they're not, but they're helpful. And a little tip is if you're asking someone for a letter of support or collaboration, it's really nice to draft something for them, because a lot of times you're collaborating with someone who maybe is more senior than you or who is very busy. And so if you send them a draft of what you want the letter to say, they'll just sign it and send it back. You're not putting the burden on them to do the work. Just a caution, if you're working with multiple collaborators and it's sort of similar, draft the letter differently so you don't end up with identical letters of collaboration. The biographical sketch, or CV, is a very important part of almost every grant because that shows your capabilities. Are you capable of doing this? And most grants have certain formats for the biographical sketch, and you need to follow those very closely. Or this proposal did not include a timeline, which is required. And again, timeline shows that you can do the work in the time required. Okay. So supporting materials can take a lot of time to assemble. You can not wait until the very last minute to do a grant. I know, especially if you're a student, looking back to my own graduate student days, there's a tendency to do things at the last minute or pull all-nighters or wait to the 11th hour. But with grants, you really can't do that. And part of it is because of the supporting materials. It's not just you writing the research plan. You need to follow budget guidelines very carefully and justify your requests. And you definitely need to check the math in your budget. Your numbers need to add up, or the funder might start to scrutinize things a lot more closely.
Another mistake that grant writers sometimes make, especially newer grant writers, is to not contact the program manager with specific questions that you might have. Some people think that you shouldn't ask the program manager a question, or they don't want to ask the program manager a question and try to sort of figure it out on for themselves of what the guidelines state, with the hope that they can, explain later that they didn't understand the guidelines, which will not ever work. So to be successful in grant writing, if you have questions about the guidelines, specific questions, you can certainly communicate with your program manager. Program managers are there to help you. I'm the program manager for Spark, Beth's the program manager for Aspire. Every funding program has a program manager who is available to answer questions. And this person can help you clarify any nuances of the guidelines that you don't quite understand, or if you have a situation that doesn't quite seem to fit within the guidelines. It's better to ask these questions well ahead of time and clear it with the program manager so that you know, yes, you are or you are not eligible, or yes, this is the correct way to do it, or yes, you can or cannot ask for that. Program managers are there to help you. One word of caution, though, is to carefully read the guidelines and know them up one side and down the other before you contact the program manager. You don't want to contact a program manager with a question that can be answered by reading the guidelines. But oftentimes when you do read the guidelines, there are subtle questions that aren't quite answered by the guidelines that you need to have clarified before you submit the proposal, and that's when you need to contact your program manager, and they are there to help you.
Mistake 10, assume that all of your experiments will work out as predicted. Do not include a backup plan in your proposal. Well, I think a lot of people, including faculty, think, well, I don't want to point out a problem because that's bad. And so they don't mention things that could go wrong with their science. The problem with that is if there is something that could go wrong, A, you're not presenting an alternative plan, and B, you're letting the reviewers think that you don't realize that something could go wrong, which is worse because it makes it seem like you haven't thought the whole thing through. And we see this quite a bit with Aspire. I'd say this was a major thing that causes proposals to not be funded for our internal programs. There's no backup plan if the experiments don't work out as expected. There's no alternative approach. You know, you can say, well, if X doesn't happen, then I'm going to try Y. You know, you need to be upfront with the fact that there could be a pitfall, but you know how to solve that. You don't want the reviewer to think, well, if he doesn't know there's a pitfall, he won't know how to solve it. If you don't have preliminary studies, which of course for internal programs, a lot of people don't, you know, you really need to show that you thought about alternative plans because you might not have ever done this before. And it's okay that you've never done it before, but there has to be evidence that you've thought things through. So you should outline alternative plans for experiments if they don't have the expected results. Very important, if you have several aims, do not make parts 2 and 3, let's say, contingent on the fact that part 1 is going to work. Because if part 1 doesn't work and there's no alternative, then the whole thing is shot. So that's very critical. You can have parts that are somewhat connected, but you also have to be able to complete the whole project regardless if one of them fails. As I just mentioned a moment ago, if you don't outline an alternate plan, reviewers will just assume, you know, you really aren't, maybe you don't know what you're doing. So it's not problematic to point out the fact that there could be pitfalls with your work.
So that concludes the 10 most common mistakes part of the workshop. But we also wanted to include just a few last-minute tips and final thoughts that we hope will help you as you embark on your grant writing career. When we talk about the abstract, you have to think about the abstract being absolutely critical to your proposal, because this is the first impression reviewers have. If you're writing a proposal where an abstract is required, this is the first thing they're going to look at. That's the first impression you're going to make to the reviewers, and that can color how a reviewer reads your proposal based on whether or not they're impressed by the abstract or whether or not the abstract did not impress them. You want to state who you are, what you plan to do, and how you plan to do it. You want to write it very clearly, very succinctly, and very logically. The abstract is really important. You're probably going to write it last after your proposal is already completed, but absolutely do not save it for the last minute, given the importance of the abstract in terms of making the first impression. You do not want any grammatical errors in that. You want to make it clean and concise as possible.
All right, the research plan itself. First of all, you need to talk about the problem that exists or what you're trying to do and why is it significant. You have to establish that your project is significant in your field, to you personally. You need to, as we've talked about previously, show that you have an understanding of your field, highlight some key literature in your field. And as I mentioned previously, this is another place where I think it's good to maybe you judiciously use highlights or italics. You know, it seems obvious, but actually say something like, this project is significant or important because. Really make it clear to the reviewer. And it may seem obvious to you, but if you use a phrase like that, the reviewer will immediately key in on it and say, oh, wow, okay, I can see why this is important.
And this is a diagram from Karen Kelsky, who writes The Professor is In. There's a link to her website and this template included in one of your handouts, the Grant Writing Resources handout. So I would encourage y'all to look at this. I really like this template because it sort of clarifies what you need to do in that important introduction. How do you walk someone who's not from your field into your proposal and clarify the significance of it clearly? And I really like this framework where you start out in your introduction with a large general topic of interest, you refer to the literature, you set up the context, and then you have a statement to the effect of, however, this has not been addressed. And that's your lead in to what you're going to do with that proposal. So with this framework, you sort of set up the big picture, why this is important, what we know, what we don't know, and this is what this proposal is going to do. I just really think this is a nice sort of template to think about, especially if you're new to grant writing and haven't done a lot of this. This gives you a starting point.
Well, what do you really need? What is the heart of the research plan? Well, you need to identify your results, both long-term and short-term. So long-term, maybe this will provide a real advancement in your field. Short-term, maybe you're going to just accomplish X and Y. And the objectives for your proposal should be measurable and realistic and time limited. You always have to keep in mind how much time you have for each grant. I know for Spire it's 15 months, Spark is the same. Do not try to promise that you're going to do 5 years worth of work in 15 months. It gets back to that you don't want to be overly ambitious. An effective objective states a desired outcome in measurable terms. You have to be able to measure what you're doing so that the reviewer has a really good idea of what you intend to do and how you will do it. They should be able to explain and advocate for your project to the review panel, because that's what happens. Proposals are discussed. They should be able to give a very brief synopsis that outlines that, and they should be able to do it clearly and effectively.
So we also wanted to spend a little bit more time on the timeline, just because it is such an important part of a proposal, because it directly addresses the issue of feasibility, which is a huge question in reviewers' minds. When you're putting together a timeline, you want to make sure the timeline matches the activities described in the methods and the evaluation sections of your proposal. It's really helpful for the reviewers if the summary is visual, if it's a graphical depiction of time on a chart of some sort. It's helpful to use months and not try to use specific dates. You could have blocks of like 3 month blocks. You could have 1 month blocks, 6 month blocks, whatever works for your project. But you want to have something that's easy to read and obviously gives enough time to complete the various tasks that you're describing. You want to clearly explain the sequence of events and the timing for every part of the project. You also want to allow time on your timeline. You want to allow space for writing up your project, for analyzing your results, and for presenting your work, because that's all part of the project, especially if you're asking for funding to cover presenting at a conference or something like that. The key to a timeline, and a good timeline, is to be specific and to be realistic about what you can accomplish. You want the reviewers to look at the timeline and go, okay, that looks like they can get that done in that amount of time. That looks realistic. Everything's happening in the right order. This is where you sort of show the reviewers, yes, you really do know what you're doing and how long it's going to take.
And we touched on this previously, but make sure you anticipate reviewers' concerns and be upfront about any potential limitations of your work. so that reviewers don't do that for you.
And just sort of a couple of final thoughts. At the end of the day, what are reviewers looking for when they're reading a proposal? What do they really need to know when they finish your proposal? They need to know, without a shadow of a doubt, what you're proposing to do, why it's important. You should have established the significance very early on, and can you do it? That is what they need to know. What are you going to do? Why is it important? And can you do it?
And Lauren talked a few minutes ago about the summary being really important. Well, that first paragraph of your proposal is critical. Reviewers are busy. They might have 10, 12 proposals to read. They're sitting there at their house late at night reading them. They're not being paid to read your proposal. You need to draw them in and get them excited about your work in that very first paragraph.
I always think about it with the first paragraph is you want to set the stage to make them want to continue reading, to make them think it's going to be interesting and make them want to read it. So another final thought, and we've touched on this before, is think of your proposal as an example of the type of work that you produce. And you want it to be absolutely the best it can be because it's representing what you're capable of doing. Reviewers are very hesitant to recommend someone for funding who doesn't follow directions and who doesn't use correct grammar or spell correctly. It doesn't instill confidence in reviewers when the proposal is full of mistakes. But if you turn in a really well-written proposal that doesn't have any grammatical errors, that followed all the rules, then they're probably going to feel pretty confident about recommending your proposal for funding, provided the idea is sound.
And I want to remind everyone, because I think sometimes faculty don't think of things in this way, but a grant is a piece of persuasive writing. So it's your responsibility as a proposal writer to persuade the reviewer that your work is important, that you've thought through the research plan and your objectives very clearly, and that your proposal should be funded, because the reviewers are the people who make recommendations to the funding agency, whether that be an internal funder or an external one, that your work is one of those that should be funded. You want the reviewers to be able to advocate for your proposal.
And that concludes the prepared portion of this workshop.
If you have questions,
Great. Thank you so much, Lauren and Beth. I'm going to advance here to the final slide as we take questions. So for those of you who are listening, if you have a question to ask, please type that in the chat box. So while you all are thinking of questions to ask, I'm going to pose a question to you, Beth and Lauren. I'm very interested in what additional resources might be available to support graduate students in their development of actual proposals, of course, in addition to their mentors and advisors and work.
Were you referring to on-campus resources or external?
Yes, sorry. So here at the university, if you could share with us a little bit about recapping, you alluded to several of these during the webinar, but recapping research proposal development resources that are available for graduate students.
Well, certainly going back to the beginning of the presentation, Pivot is a key resource for finding proposals. If students are applying for external grants and they need to be submitted on behalf of the university, our Sponsored Awards Management Office certainly can provide support for that. Our offices of Student Fellowship.
Office of Fellowships and Scholar Programs.
Thank you.
If students are applying to major research fellowships like a Fulbright, a Rotary International, or even NSF, graduate research grants in their first year of graduate school, the Office of Fellowships and Scholar Programs offers a series of workshops to help students prepare for those, and they also work one-on-one with specific students applying to major competitive fellowships. And also the SPARK program, the deadline is in the fall, and I run probably 4 different application workshops related to SPARK. They're usually about an hour long, and I sort of walk everyone through the parts of the proposal and what's expected and required, and those are a requirement for applying to Spark, but it's also sort of a, I guess, professional development opportunity as well.
And one thing we maybe didn't touch on fully, although of course we alluded to it in the presentation, is when you apply to an internal program like Spark or Aspire, you receive feedback from the reviewers. You receive comments that are constructive. So even if you don't get funded, you have that feedback to go forward to your next grant submission. And every person who applies for grants gets rejected. They don't get funded every time, but they get comments that helps make that grantsmanship process better and better each time.
I appreciate that point as someone who has not had every grant I've written funded. So I do think it's a learning process, and the feedback that you receive is very valuable. We do have a question from one of our participants. How long is the typical process after a proposal is submitted?
Well, that's a great question, and it really varies by funding source. It actually can be a lengthy process in some cases. External funders, big federal agencies like NSF or NIH, it can be 3 to 6 months before you find out if you're going to be funded, and then it can be several more months before you are funded, receive the money if you're selected for funding. Internally, for Aspire, for example, our Aspire 1 deadline is in January, and we notify applicants at the end of April if they're going to be funded, and then they receive the funding by July 1st.
And for Spark, the deadline this year was late October. Students should be notified by the end of January, beginning of February, so about 3 months or so. And then the funding will be in place for a May 1st start date.
So it is not instantaneous, and that's true of most funders because the review process takes time. It takes time to identify reviewers. It takes time for the reviewers to read proposals and provide reviews, and then for the agency to evaluate the results of the review process.
And on a related note, I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about the process leading up to submission, about how long as a reminder, how long would you recommend that planning process to be, or explain some of the variability there?
Another great question. You definitely don't want to start planning the day of the deadline. I would recommend that no matter what you're working on, you should start preparing as far ahead as you can. Certainly for something like Spark or Aspire, I would give yourself at least 6 weeks or 2 months to really work on the proposal, have a friend or a colleague review it, get all your supporting documents together. Larger center-level grants I've worked on, we've worked on for 18 months. So it is a time-consuming process.
For Spark, I always encourage students to get started over the summer, and I encourage them to come and meet with me to talk about their ideas over the summer as well, so that when the fall comes and classes and teaching and everything gets started, they've already sort of gotten a head start.
Excellent. And I'm wondering if you have any final thoughts as we're closing in on our time together this afternoon. Any closing thoughts or recommendations? If we're going to walk away from this great information you shared today, what are the 2 or 3 things maybe that we should all remember about grant writing and being successful?
I would say number 1, don't be discouraged if you're not funded, and don't take the comments personally, which can be easier said than done, I realize. But the key to grant writing, I think, is sort of practice and going through the process and getting comments and making it better each time.
I would say follow the directions. Follow the directions. Follow the directions, because it's remarkable how many people do not. I think if you can do that and present a clear, well-written proposal, you're already putting yourself in the top half of proposals. And about the fact that our internal programs fund about 35%, I mean, then you stand a pretty good chance if you've placed yourself in that top half. So take time on your proposal. Do not wait until the last minute. Grantsmanship is not something that you should be working on at 4:30 when you have to have it submitted by 5 o'clock.
Point well taken. We do have one more question that came through that I'll ask you before we wrap things up, if that's okay.
Yes.
The question is, are there proposals or examples of proposals we can look at or that are available for graduate students?
Not at the moment, not for Spark, but I would encourage students to speak to people in their department who have been funded before and ask if they would be willing to share their proposals.
I do share an example of a funded postdoc Aspire proposal at the question and answer workshop. So if you're a postdoc and are coming to that, there is an example of a funded proposal from a previous cycle.
Okay. I appreciate the recommendation. I know that when several of the graduate students with whom I'm working are preparing to write proposals, I try to share examples with them, even if they're not the same as the mechanism that they're applying to, but just to give them some general grantsmanship guidelines and information on proposals, structure and how to formulate those. So I really appreciate that recommendation about checking in with mentors as well as students, your peer group, who have had the applications funded through the Spark mechanism or in other ways. Well, I want to take this opportunity to go ahead. Do you have anything else?
I would say the NIH does have some funded proposals available on its website. Not necessarily student-oriented, but they do give examples of funded proposals.
Great. Another good tip to know. I'm certain that if you go to the NIH.gov website, you'll be able to tap into those, or, of course, searching online to connect to those. I want to thank very much our presenters today, Lauren Clark and Beth Herron with the Office of Research at the University of South Carolina. Thank you for sharing your time and expertise with our graduate students as part of our professional development programming. And as a reminder, we've included the link to the calendar on the grad school website, which includes our hashtag GradProfDEV opportunities. You also can check us out on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, WordPress, and YouTube. And our topic for this Friday, today, on December 2nd, is self-care, which is an appropriate topic for this time of the year. It's the end of the semester. The holidays are upon us. It's almost the end of the year. A lot going on, and so making sure that we take care of ourselves. So we hope that you'll check out our Professional Development Friday posts today and every day. And if you want to learn more about the research resources available for graduate students, a couple of weeks ago, Lauren and Beth took part in our Professional Development Fridays postings and have shared a blog with us and also filmed a video and a Q&A. The handouts are available as long as the webinar is active, so please access those if you would like those additional resources. And shortly after the webinar today, the recording will be available. And even if you were unable to watch this webinar in its entirety, you will still be able to access the recording. And that goes for those who were unable to join us today. They will receive the recording. So if you have any friends or peers who may be interested in this topic, please encourage them to sign up using the same registration link, and they will be provided with a link to view the recorded webinar. With that, we hope you have a very safe and happy holiday break. Our next webinars will be on January 10th, focused on the Graduate Civic Scholars Program, and January 27th, the Paper Chase, a team science approach to paper writing. So publishing and using a team science approach for creating peer-reviewed journal articles for submission. So we have a lot more planned for the spring, and we hope you will continue to take part in our professional development programming. Thank you very much, and have a great day.